Coming up on the Daily with me, Niall Paterson, the tragedy of Sara Sharif. Could she have been saved? Back in a moment. Hi everybody. Today we're going to be taking a look at the death of Sara Sharif, a 10-year-old girl who, according to the people that knew her best, loved to sing and dreamt of going on the X Factor. But Sara's dream was never fulfilled because she was murdered by her own father and stepmother. Therefore, a lot of what we will be discussing is pretty grim, so this is not one to be listening to with the kids around. In fact, if you've got kids, you may well have done the exact same thing as me and avoided or even ignored the story as much as possible. But the detail is important, and no matter how badly she was treated in life, perhaps even more horrifying is that there are other Sara Sharifs out there, right now, just waiting to happen. This time on the Daily, we are asking, why could no one save Sara Sharif? Our social affairs correspondent is Becky Johnson. Becky, just tell us exactly who Sara was.
Sara Sharif was a 10-year-old girl murdered at her home in Surrey. She was born to her father, Urfan Sharif, and Polish mother. She lived a life that was marked by involvement of the authorities due to concerns and allegations that had been made against her parents even before she was born. And those concerns and the involvement of all the authorities continued throughout her life until she very sadly died.
What about her personality?
Her teachers remember her as a little girl who was always smiling. And when we see photos of her, we see that beautiful smile. But now we know just the horror of what was going on behind closed doors. She was suffering such horrendous abuse. In the trial, it was described that the abuse had become normalised to her. But on the surface at school, her teachers say she loved to sing, she loved to dance. They just remember her being happy and friendly and chatty. Her dream at one point was to go on the X Factor. She was just always taking part in dance shows. And for her teachers and her friends, particularly the close-knit community where she was at school, her loss has been utterly devastating.
It is those teachers, it is those friends, those neighbours who will first notice changes in the behaviour or even the first signs of the abuse that was taking place.
Indeed, and we heard neighbours telling the criminal trial that they had heard screams coming from the house. We know that teachers had become concerned about bruising that they'd seen on Sara's face and indeed referred that to social services. We know that Sara had also begun wearing the hijab in the year before her death, and the suggestion now is that that was to hide some of the terrible injuries that were being inflicted on her.
Tell us then about Sara's parents and indeed stepmother.
Sara's father, Urfan Sharif, already, even before Sara was born, previous partners had made allegations of abuse against him. Her birth mother, Olga, was from Poland. There were also allegations of abuse against her. During the early years of her life, her parents separated. Sara spent some time in foster care. She was the subject of a child protection plan from birth. That means that social services deemed her to be at risk. And then the involvement of services continued. The family courts were involved with custody battles. And in 2019, the family court awarded custody to Sara's father, Urfan Sharif, and his new partner, Sara's stepmother, Beinash Batool. And it was after that we know some of this dreadful abuse was going on behind closed doors. And it really was horrendous, the details that came out in court. We know that Sara was subjected to beatings, burnt with an iron. She was hooded, she was bitten. She had dozens of injuries, broken bones all over her little body. Effectively, when she died, her body just couldn't bear the abuse any longer. It is so desperately sad. And yet the warning signs were there throughout her life. The authorities were involved. In fact, pretty much every agency that is there to protect vulnerable children from this kind of monstrous harm. And at no point did anyone remove her from the care of that father and stepmother who've ultimately been found guilty of her murder.
But those bruises that were identified by teachers at the school, I mean, that prompted the school to get in contact with social services, didn't it?
This is perhaps the key missed opportunity where really more questions should have been asked. So this was bruising around Sara's face that the school were really concerned about, so concerned that they referred it to Surrey Social Services. Now, as I understand, that referral was looked at by social workers. They contacted Sara's father, told him they were going to run some multi-agency checks, discovered that the last contact with the family had been those family court proceedings where the father had been awarded custody in 2019, and then decided to close the case only 6 days after the referral. Now, the key question is, why was Sara's history, the long history of contact with the authorities, the long history of warning signs, not a red flag, a massive red flag? Then, weeks later, Sara's father removed her from school for homeschooling. Again, now serious questions being asked. Should a child where concerns had been raised about potential abuse ever have been allowed to be removed from school, removed from the sight of people who could have helped her, and homeschooled? And that happened just 4 months before her murder. Why was there not more curiosity? Why was more not done? But it wasn't. And that is something that social services will have to answer. There is an independent review. Why did they not do more? And why, when the school then alerted social workers that weeks later Sara had been removed from school for homeschooling, did no one intervene?
My question's pretty simple. Why were these agencies not sharing that information as a matter of course?
It seems almost unbelievable to me. And why would a child with Sara's history not come with a massive red flag? You know, a child that has been so involved with the services, so many warning signs, and then a school is concerned about abuse. Why does that not set in process a train of events where people are actively trying to remove her from harm? And that's something that we need to understand, and something that indeed the Children's Commissioner is now calling on government to urgently address. She said data sharing simply has to be better. The family courts need to know what social services know. Social services need to know what the police know. All the services should be joining up, and there should be some kind of database where a child's name can be entered and everything immediately is available to whoever is looking to really set a system into process where a child known to be so incredibly vulnerable can then be helped.
Becky, thank you. When we come back, what needs to change to ensure that child protection services actually do protect children like Sara? Clearly, a lot of mistakes, perhaps failures, by those who could have protected Sara Sharif contributed to her death. So why did things go so badly wrong in this and other cases? Dr Ciaran Murphy is a board member and trustee of the Association of Child Protection Professionals. He himself spent 10 years as a child protection officer and now spends his time as an academic within child protection, teaching others wanting to get into the profession. Ciaran, let's just start with your reaction to the specifics of Sara's case. From your perspective, what went wrong?
There are crucial elements, I think, that retrospectively we will look back and say, what was the basis of the decision-making there? What was the rationale of the decision-making there? And I think three that come to mind of the decision to place Sara by the family court in the care of a father, despite a pretty extensive history of violence towards different individuals, including children. Number two, the decision by the local authority to close the case, no further action following the referral by St Mary's Primary School with concerns about physical abuse. And then thirdly, one that I haven't got a clear picture on at the moment, but I'd be very interested to understand. When Sara was pulled out of school, What did the school and social services do after that? Was that decision clearly communicated to social services? Because we know that when children become less visible, it helps a perpetrator of abuse to conceal that abuse. So I think there's three crucial points that we need to scrutinise, and that will probably come apparent in the safeguarding report into this case.
Mistakes were clearly made in the case of Sara, and mistakes have been made time and again in other cases. What on earth is the problem with child protection services in this country? Because they are not doing what it says on the tin.
I mean, I should say that research says that we have one of the best child protection systems in the world. However, it certainly isn't perfect, and mistakes continue to be made through the 70s, through the 80s, 90s. Every high-profile child death tragedy, Peter Connolly, Victoria Climbié, Arthur Labinjo Hughes, Starr Hobson, Finlay Bowden, four principal themes always re-emerge. Number one, poor information sharing between agencies. Number two, poor multi-agency working between agencies. Number three, inexperienced staff in the child protection system. And number four is about a lack of resources, a lack of funding.
Let's work our way through those. When you describe poor information sharing as being an issue, what do you mean?
When we look at some of these high-profile cases, there has typically been an assumption that one agency who holds information assumes that another agency has that information. For example, I'm looking at the reporting of Sara's case, and it's noteworthy the evidence that came out within the court of the neighbours. Lots of anecdotes there about hearing what might be perceived as abuse within the family home. But then that was never raised to the police or social workers. For example, in the Victoria Climbié case, which is over 20 years old now, Victoria was hospitalised in multiple NHS trusts, and that was not clearly communicated between those trusts. For example, sometimes it's about having information on offending behaviour by an individual that's not passed on to other agencies. People often are fearful of sharing information for fear of contravening data protection laws. And something I always say is that child protection concerns supersede everything else. And we need to try and address that, I think, as a society and a child protection system.
That goes to your second point, that actually these agencies don't work well together.
Traditionally, that's been the case. I mean, the statutory guidance, Neil, for working together in a child protection context is called Working Together to Safeguard Children. Within that, it is stipulated that the lead professional in child protection cases should be the social worker. I think, though, sometimes how that's interpreted in a multi-agency context is that it becomes an over to you in terms of the social worker's responsibility, whereas that working should really still be a collaborative effort by all of the agencies involved. We need to have a broader message about that within society, neighbours as well as agencies, members of the public that see things. My wife occasionally gets irritated by me speaking up when I see bad behaviour by adults around children, and I say, but that's that thing about safeguarding is everybody's responsibility.
Yeah, it takes a village sometimes,
Yes,
doesn't
absolutely.
it, Ciaran? But with your background in social work and social services yourself, I mean, clearly they are doing an incredibly difficult, incredibly important job across the country. But have they got the tools to do that job? Do we have enough of them?
There's been a huge increase in families falling into crisis, placing a massive demand on the system. In this country, we're approaching nearly 100,000 looked after children, whereas only a few years ago we had only 60,000, nearly doubling in a short period of time. But what that means is social workers have high caseloads. Child protection social workers should have a maximum of 13 cases. My piece of research last year, 201 child protection social workers, I asked them lots of things. One of them was, what's your caseload size? Average caseload size from those 201 social workers was 38.
What are the consequences of having such a significantly increased caseload?
What happens is you have a social worker with 2 or 3 times the demand of what we would want, and they have to engage in the process of prioritisation. They have to say, there's 3 needy children that need me to respond here right now. Which one am I going to prioritise? Prioritise on the basis of immediacy instead of the individual needs of each child. Something that we want to work towards is that every child who is receiving services from the system is a priority. But the way the system is designed at the moment, with huge caseloads and chronic underfunding, means that there aren't enough hours in the day. And when you are prioritising, you're going to make errors in judgment.
Walk us through then, Ciaran, the way in which this chronic underfunding, as you and others, I should say, have described it, really does have an impact on social services and child protection in general.
The previous government commissioned and spent a lot of money on it, a review of children's social care, which they championed as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reform the system. But one of the main recommendations was that £2.6 billion should be invested in England's children's social care system over 2 years. So what happened after that is that the government only committed £200 million in the context of that 2.6 billion. Now that's less than 8% of what that review said we needed to get the children's services system back to a level of safe operation. The new government have now committed £250 million, but that's still less than 10% of all that a huge review said we need. If these are the most emotionally priceless individuals in our society, surely they are worth investing in. It's right that we are shocked and appalled after these high-profile tragedies. But unfortunately, lots of us aren't that surprised because we know about how the system is being neglected in a monetary sense by central government. And it is an area that we really need to place a spotlight on if we are to improve the chances of these vulnerable children who deserve that.
It is a wonder then that anyone actually chooses to remain in social work, in child protection. What have all these factors taken together done for retention within the industry?
It's something that people do with a passion, that people are hugely committed to protecting children. And that's why they do it, because it's rather a thankless task. It's a task that after a high-profile child death tends to take a lot of bashing. And so it's something you have to really have a desire to do in order to do it. And I'd love to take this opportunity to commend those people who are doing their best against the odds to protect children in this society at the moment. But what I should say is we have, as well as chronic underfunding, chronic workforce instability within the child protection system at the moment. We have a 22% vacancy rate. We have an 18% locum/agency social work rate. So that means we have 40% of the child protection workforce who are unstable. It means that people who are left behind have higher caseloads. But what it also means for the children in receipt of those services is that they experience it as social workers coming and going, not being able to establish a relationship. We need to build relationships with children so that they feel able to trust us as a practitioner and volunteer some of that information to us about what's going on in their private family home. We know that if you're a new person coming into a child's life, they're not going to readily disclose abuse. And the problem with the chronic workforce instability, people burning out, social workers getting ill health, I should say that the average social worker in child protection now lasts less than a year.
Wow.
In practice. So there is a responsibility, I think, after these high-profile death tragedies, for us also to be saying we need to invest in the system, but also to say, let's change the narrative around these individuals. Let's set these individuals up to succeed. Let's give them manageable caseloads. Let's portray them in a more positive light and give them some kudos when for the things that go right. Because what social workers say to me is it's not worth it anymore. We're receiving abuse when we go into the supermarket with our children. People are spitting in our faces. I go around for a meal with my extended family and they say to me, why the hell are you doing this anymore? Pack it in. It's not worth it. Look at the impact on your health. Look at how many hours you're doing. A huge proportion of the social workers I interviewed this week, the people who qualified to be social workers, who I interviewed this year, are working in jobs like the checkout at Asda, driving for Amazon, because they see it as less stressful.
Dr Ciaran Murphy, great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for the time.
For much more on this story, head to skynews.com. We'll see you again tomorrow.